This week, we're back in Flanders, and I'm standing in the village of Loker as it is today, a village once behind the lines for most of the Great War. I'm standing close to a busy road, but still here in Flanders, the birds sing, and I'm looking out across the green, lush land that leads up to Kemmel Hill. Welcome to the old front line, with me, military historian Paul Reed. Each week I bring you a glimpse into the battlefields of the Great War, and we walk together along the lanes and past the cemeteries that act as beacons here to events more than a century ago. So let's strap on our boots, take our pack, and head out along the old front line. We're standing outside the church in the village of Locre, or Loker, as it's known today. This area of Flanders at the time of the First World War, and when we look at World War I period maps, we see that all of the villages here and the towns and the locations had French names. The French language in Belgium at the time of the First World War was the dominant language, and a lot of the British maps that Britain took to war and the map data that we used from Belgian sources took and used these French names. In the post-Second World War period, there was a resurgence of Flemish nationalism, and it led to the Flemish dialect, the Flemish language, being properly recognised. And here in Flanders, all of the locations, the towns, the villages, the little communes, all were given their proper Flemish names. That's why we see this disparity in the naming of locations on First World War period maps and the maps that we use today. The village of Locre, as it was then, was some way behind the front lines, and it remained behind those lines for most of the war. The British Army moved into this sector alongside French troops at the tail end of the First Battle of Ypres in the autumn of 1914, and when the front lines were established along the Messines Ridge, villages like Locre became important locations in our infrastructure behind the battlefield, and it was a place where British soldiers were billeted, first in the farms and in the houses amongst the civilian population, and then as the army grew, these could not be accommodated with that limited available accommodation. So the army built its own camps, first with tents and then with huts. And we'll return to the subject of camps in this area later on in the walk, when we walk down into the place where many of those camps were located. Although it was behind the lines, it was shelled. There was damage to Locre as early as 1914. I have a photo album of an officer in the Army Service Corps, and I'll put a couple of the pictures on the podcast website, www.oldfrontline.co.uk, so you can see the photographs and get an insight into what the landscape here looked like in that earlier period of the war. So it was damaged by shell fire, but it wasn't entirely destroyed. However, in April 1918, the Battle of the Lys swept through here, and villages like Locre in that final year of the war, in the final months of the war really, were obliterated by shell fire. And again, I'll put a photograph of Locre, a postcard from just after the war, showing it completely razed to the ground. It became part of that devastated zone, the Zone Rouge, that stretched from Belgium right across France, where communes and villages and towns were completely destroyed by the hand of war. And this is a good example of it. So as we stand here and we look at the church and the smart Flemish buildings around us, these are all buildings that date from the 1920s or later. The entire village was rebuilt after the war. Now, one of the things that I like to do in this podcast is flag up some books that are perhaps lesser known, particularly memoirs of the First World War. And one of those that relates to the village of Locre, where we are now, is the Journal of Private Fraser. Donald Fraser was a Scotsman who had emigrated to Canada before the First World War, and he joined the 31st Battalion Canadian Infantry, the Alberta Regiment, in 1914, and latterly served with the Canadian Machine Gun Corps in the final year or so of the war. He kept a diary during the war, and in the interwar period, sometime in the 20s and 30s, he greatly expanded upon that and wrote a memoir, but it was not published in his lifetime. It was eventually published by quite a small Canadian publishing company in the 1980s, and I came across it because I knew a veteran of the 31st Battalion Canadian Infantry, Lance Catamol, and he recommended the book to me. Fraser's account is quite remarkable. He had an incredible eye for detail. He records all sorts of things in his diaries. And this is his account of Locre in 1915 when he was here with the men from his battalion. The village is dirty and the buildings seem old and unsanitary. The inside of the houses are bare and untidy. What pictures or ornaments there are usually emblematic of Catholicism. The people themselves are unkempt. Most of them have a smattering of English, picked up from the soldiers, and often use swear words not knowing what they mean. The troops air their French, which usually amounts to Madame, Café, Compris, Oui, and a few other words. A conversation between a soldier and a Belgian is very amusing. Every third word is punctuated with Compris and Oui with gesticulations. So that slang French that soldiers use behind the lines here in the Great War was really a language in its own right, and some of it still exists in our own language today. Vin Blanc white wine was commonly available in the cafes and the staminets behind the trenches, but British soldiers could not say Vin Blanc. They said Vin Plonk, and plonk, of course, is a word we still use to describe cheap wine. Not that many of us in lockdown have perhaps drunk too much cheap wine. From outside the church, we can clearly see that there are war graves here. So we'll go on in to our left to the larger plot. In total, there are 184 British burials here and 31 Canadians, including 2 unknown soldiers. The majority of the men here are known because these were men either killed in the front line or killed in and around Locre and buried by their comrades, so the men who buried them knew who they were and their identities were known. The first burials were made here in December of 1914, and they continued until the time of the Battle of Messines in June of 1917. The 31 Canadian graves are mainly from the early months of 1916, when the men of the Canadian Corps were holding the Messines Ridge on the other side of Kemmel itself, between Witcharter and the Kemmel Road. As you walk around the graves here, one inscription catches your eye. It's on the grave of Cecil Horden, who was a second lieutenant in the 1st 4th Battalion of the Yorkshire Regiment, the Greenhowards, and it reads, "His 2 brothers also fell. In death they are not divided." Mr. and Mrs. Horden, who lived in Upsall Grange, quite a large house near Nunthorpe, not far from Middlesbrough in Yorkshire, lost 3 sons. Cecil, killed here in Flanders on the Messines Ridge. He had another brother who was an army chaplain, who was buried at Turlington Cemetery near Boulogne, having died of his wounds just after the armistice in November 1918. And a third brother had died just before that, on the 4th of November 1918, while serving as a gunner officer in the Royal Garrison Artillery. He's buried at Risnes Communal Cemetery. And their story is a reminder, if one is needed, that some families paid a heavy toll for their service in the Great War. It's unimaginable to us, for a mother, for a father, to lose 3 of their sons, 2 of them in the same month of the same year, right at the end of the conflict, when it probably seemed that it was almost over. Among the burials here are 3 men who were tried by Field General Court-Martial, found guilty of their crime, in this case desertion, and sentenced to death, and so were executed by firing squad, shot at dawn, as it's most commonly called now. This is a subject that brings out a lot of debates connected to the Great War, and is seen as a great injustice to the soldiers who served in that conflict. We have to see it in some sort of proportion, that there are over 3,000 men sentenced to death, but only 1 in 10 of those were actually executed for military crimes. And there's a widespread belief that the army did not recognise shell shock in the First World War, and as soon as a soldier showed any signs of it, he was put against a wall and shot by firing squad. Again, that's a myth. The British Army had shell shock casualty clearing stations from 1915, and it was a recognised condition. How the army went on to treat it, of course, that's a very different subject altogether. But these 3 men had one thing in common: they were regular soldiers. And the regular army before the war recruited men from the lower strata of British society, and regular soldiers in peacetime were always getting into trouble. They knew that if they did things that were wrong in the eyes of the army, in the eyes of the War Office, there would be consequences, there would be infractions, they'd lose money, they'd be detained. On active service, there was an added element to this, in that it carried potentially the death sentence if you broke the rules that the army had laid out for time on active service. And I think that in the early period of the war, not every regular soldier really understood this properly, and it led to cases like these three. So who were they? Well, two of them were from the same battalion, the 1st Battalion, Royal Scots Fusiliers, and they were executed the same day on the 6th of February 1915. Private Joseph Byers was a 19-year-old regular soldier, and while on a ration party near the village of West Ypres behind the lines, he went missing. He absented himself from his unit, and he was caught some days later by a Belgian gendarme, a policeman, walking along the Ypres-Popperinge road. He was arrested and then detained and tried by Field General Court Martial. He claimed that he'd actually been hospitalised at Kemmel for 3 days and had been wandering around trying to make his way back to his battalion, but this wasn't believed. And he made the deadly mistake, really, of admitting his guilt, of pleading guilty at the trial, which pretty much sealed his fate. And on top of that, the army commander, Smith Dorrien, had said that discipline in the 1st Battalion Royal Scots Fusiliers had been very bad for some time, and I think a severe example is very much wanted. And both him and Private Andrew Evans of the 1st Battalion Royal Scots Fusiliers, an older soldier at the age of 41, were executed by firing squads, not side by side in separate incidents, but nevertheless they were shot from the same battalion, sending a message to the men of that battalion: if you do these things, if you step out of line, if you walk away from the battlefield area, you could suffer the same fate. And that concept of, for the sake of example, was what many at the time, these executions, were all about, sending a message to the men. Now, the two men in the Royal Scots Fusiliers were both arrested very close to the areas where they'd deserted. Some men got much further away, and Private George Collins, who's buried here, he was from Hessel Road in Hull and was a regular soldier in the 1st Battalion of the Lincolnshire Regiment, also absconded from near the village of West Ypres and made his way not just to neighbouring towns and villages, but off into France, and found himself in Paris and was eventually arrested at Le Mans, some 300 miles away from where his battalion was at that time. He was brought back, tried again by Field General Court Martial, found guilty of the crime and sentenced to death. So 3 men here, of the 300 or so men executed in the First World War, gives us an insight into this subject. We look back with 21st century eyes and we see that, to us, that this was wrong. At the time, an army marches on discipline, that's clear. Men have to be punished for stepping out of line, otherwise a regimented organisation such as an army becomes a rabble. Whether, of course, they should be executed for those crimes is a debate in its own right. And at some point in the podcast, we'll visit Popperinge behind the lines in Flanders, which is very much at the epicentre of men executed in the First World War, and we'll discuss this subject further. Walking round to the other side of the church, we see some further war graves here from the earlier period of the war, and amongst them quite a few territorial soldiers, Saturday night soldiers, men of the territorial force, including men from the Honourable Artillery Company and the 10th Battalion King's Liverpool Regiment, Liverpool Scottish. Going out through the churchyard, we walk past the village war memorial. We see some evidence here of Belgians' sacrifice in the Great War, the local men from Locre listed on the war memorial. About 30,000 Belgian soldiers were killed at the fronts, about another 10,000 died of wounds or sickness. So this was not a small number for a country like Belgium, many of them being killed either in the final year of the war or holding the line on the northern sector of Flanders up towards the coast, the so-called Ypres sector. But also on this war memorial is a plaque to a French regiment, a French cavalry regiment. They were here in 1918, not with their horses, as dismounted cavalry, as infantry, fighting alongside the British during what we call the Battle of the Lys. And we'll mention more about the French later on in this walk. Walking beyond the war memorial, we take the next turning on the right and follow this road gradually out of the village of Locre. Further along on the left, we come to a building that looks like a school or a hospital, and this is in fact the rebuilt Locre Hospice. The original hospice was sited a little bit further along this road, and we'll continue to where there's like a gatepost on the left-hand side, almost opposite where the military cemetery is seen on our right, and this is where the hospice was located. The Locre Hospice was essentially a form of convent. Nuns, Catholic nuns, lived here before the war and indeed during the war. It was used by the Royal Army Medical Corps. They took it over as an advanced dressing station quite early on in the conflict, and it remained in use until this became a frontline battlefield area in 1918. But when this was an area behind the front lines, we did not evacuate the Belgian civilians here. We had no legal right to do so unless their lives were threatened and they were under a direct line of fire from the Germans on the battlefield. Although the village was at risk from shell fire, it was considered to be an acceptable risk for the civilians. So the nuns stayed behind in the hospice, and during the war they provided food, meals for British officers, and they also sheltered quite a lot of refugees from Ypres, being almost on the front line, and in 1915 with the arrival of gas the civilians were evacuated from there, and also the outlying villages. When the Germans came in 1914, many people had fled them in the wake of that advance and had ended up in places like this. Because this had been used as a medical facility, there were graves here. There wasn't exactly a cemetery, but there were isolated graves. They were all subsequently moved and reburied in the 1920s, including to the cemetery that we can see across the fields on our right. And we'll continue further along this road and then take the path around the back of a little cottage here up to the cemetery, go in through the gate and make our visit. I mentioned that in the grounds of the hospice itself there was no military cemetery, but when it was taken over during the Battle of Messines in June of 1917 by medical units of the Royal Army Medical Corps, a cemetery was established on this spot for the men being brought in who died of their wounds, and that's how Locre Hospice Cemetery, where we are now, began. There's 255 British burials here, along with 2 Australians, 1 Canadian, 1 New Zealander and 2 Germans. The majority of the men here are known casualties. Again, this is a cemetery made during the war by medical personnel in which known casualties who had died were buried. So the chances of there being unknown soldiers here, except in post-war concentrations, was very, very slim indeed. As we go in the cemetery, up on the left is the grave of a senior officer, a Brigadier General. Brigadier General Ronald Campbell McLaughlin. He was born in 1872 and was first commissioned in 1893 into the Rifle Brigade, and he served with them in the Boer War and later in the Tibet expedition in 1903. On the outbreak of the Great War, he was one of those experienced regular army officers who helped raise and train new army formations, men from Kitchener's army, in this case the 8th Battalion of the Rifle Brigade, who he went on to command and bring to the Western Front in 1915. He was very badly wounded at Ypres in December 1915 when they were holding the line east of the city. And after recovering from that, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his bravery in the field, and then was promoted to command the 112th Infantry Brigade of the 37th Division. Now, as a brigade commander in charge of 4 infantry battalions, on paper that was over 4,000 men, his job was not to be on the battlefield itself. Theoretically, it was to be away from it, observe what was happening, absorb the information and intelligence that was coming in, and then make informed decisions based on that information. But this was a man like many of the senior officers who had been at the forefront of battle and of warfare right throughout their career. They were frustrated by this idea of being away from it, so McLaughlin went up to the front line that his brigade was holding on the other side of the Messines Ridge towards the village of Hollebeek, for a personal reconnaissance with one of the members of his staff. And this was done in broad daylight to see what the lie of the land was, what the positions were, what the advantages the enemy might have. And in doing this, he obviously exposed himself to great danger. He was seen by the Germans, observed presumably for the rank that he was. If they didn't realise he was a brigadier general, they perhaps thought he was a battalion commander or similar. And at 7 in the morning, on the 11th of August 1917, which of course at that time of year would have been pretty much broad daylight, he was shot and killed by a sniper. His body was brought back here for burial, and he is one of a number of senior officers like this buried at cemeteries, not just here in Flanders but across the British sector of the Western Front, exposing the lie of that myth that there were chateau generals who just spent their entire war behind the lines, never once seeing or going on to the battlefield. Graves like this disprove that. As we walk down the rows here as well, we notice the grave of a regiment that we don't often see on the battlefields of the First World War, at least close to where the fighting was, and that's a soldier of the British West Indies Regiment. This grave of Private David Ricketts has a date of the 7th of June 1917, and when we look into his story we see that he died serving with the 3rd Battalion of the British West Indies Regiment after having been admitted to the 113th Field Ambulance, which was located in Locre Hospice. He died on the first day of the Battle of Messines, and his unit that day was carrying shells up towards the gun sites in support of the Australian attack on Messines and the ridge itself. The British West Indies Regiment is one of the lesser known, I hasten to use the word forgotten, regiments of the First World War. It was a regiment raised in 1914 when thousands of patriotic black West Indians wanted to do their bit for the mother country and serve in the war against Germany. They flocked to enlist. Several battalions were immediately formed, and these men were trained and then sent to the front. And one of the famous photographs of them really sums up their fate in many respects. They were photographed on the road between Albert and Amiens, behind the lines on the Somme in September of 1916, when they first arrived at the front. The men are carrying Longley Enfield rifles, the Boer War period rifles that were often issued to territorials and some Kitchener battalions. But as soon as this picture was taken, the rifles that these men thought they were going to war with were taken from them and were replaced with picks and shovels. And the British West Indies Regiment for the rest of the conflict became a labour unit, fetching and carrying, moving up ammunition and supplies, digging and doing general labour tasks on or near or behind the battlefield. Nevertheless, there are graves like this scattered across the Western Front, and in a future episode of the Old Front Line we will look at the story of Britain's Black Army in the First World War, an important story that needs to be wider known. Coming out of the cemetery, we take a path that leads us round the back of the cemetery wall and out to a monument we can see in the fields close by. This is the field grave of Major Willie Redmond MP, a Catholic Irish Nationalist MP who was killed in the Battle of Messines in 1917. He was by no means a young man. He was in his mid-50s when the war broke out, but he enlisted. In the years before the Great War, Irish Nationalist MPs like him had been battling with Britain for Irish independence. But in 1914, men like Redmond put aside their differences with the British government, seeing Germany as the greater enemy. And Willie Redmond set an example to men who supported his cause, who supported the greater cause of Ireland by enlisting and joining up, and thousands of men like him did exactly the same thing. The 16th Irish Division, of which his battalion of the Royal Irish Regiment was a part, was full of men who had exactly the same views as him, and were prepared to put their lives on the line for a greater cause than the one at home. During the attack on Whitcharter, Redmond was mortally wounded, and it's said that he was picked up by a Protestant stretcher-bearer from the Ulster Division who were attacking along the flanks of the 16th Irish Division, the first time these two formations had fought side by side. The symbolism of that is not to be underrated. Redmond was evacuated back to Locre, taken into the hospice, where he died, and he was buried in the grounds of it by the Catholic nuns who tended his grave throughout the war. This monument replaced the original wooden cross, and it remains one of the few original field graves left in Flanders. I'll put some images of Redmond on the website, along with an original photograph of the grave, which was very kindly supplied by Mike Stockbridge, one of the true gentlemen of Twitter, for my book Walking Ypres, published by Pen and Sword. Leaving the cemetery, we'll return to the road and continue with our walk. Coming back out onto the roads, we'll stop for a minute and just have a look around us to see the landscape. If we use the road straight ahead as 12 o'clock, we can see in the distance there Kemmel Hill, the rising ground of Kemmel Hill. And if we look to our right at 3 o'clock, we can see the church spire of the village of Ypres. Behind us is Locre, where we started, and over to our left at about 8-9 o'clock, we can see the rising trees of the Scherpenberg, another one of the Flanders hills in this area, and spanning to our left from that, we're looking towards the French border. Beyond Balliol, we can see the Roderberg. Now, all of this ground we can see here was behind the lines for most of the war, but it was very much on the front line in the battles of April 1918. This would have been devastated ground by the conclusion of the fighting here in the autumn of that year. We'll continue along the road and we'll walk down this track into an area where during the First World War there were a vast number of hutted camps. Now, we mentioned right at the beginning that this area around Locre was used to billet troops in the First World War, first within the village and the farms, then in tented camps, and then eventually hutted camps where huts, wooden huts, Nissen huts eventually, were all brought in to house units that were out of the line, having served somewhere along the Messines Ridge. This was a common practice to put men into the frontline area, go through a few days of frontline service, then relieve them, bring them out, put them into rest, and then begin that process all over again. So when we look at the trench maps of this area, we can see marked on those maps the camps with their names, many of them named after British battle honours, particularly in this area of battles from the Crimean War, so Sebastopol, Balaclava and so on. These semi-permanent looking camps would have resembled a town really in their own right, certainly by the time of the offensives here in 1917. Now in 1918, of course, the fighting swept through here and camps like this became part of the battlefield. And there were some camps further back that were used as rest as well. And when I come here, I always think of one of the veterans that I knew who lived in the retirement home that I used to visit down in Worthing called Gifford House. In a previous episode of The Old Front Line, I spoke about George Butler, the Machine Gun Corps veteran who lived at Gifford House. And during the years that I used to go there, I met all of the veterans that passed through. And one of them was a chap from Suffolk called Frank Plum. And it's him that I think of when I walk down this area and think of these hutted camps. Not him fighting here, but this was really the scene of the end of his war in April of 1918. Frank was born in the Suffolk village of Copdock in 1897. His parents ran the post office there. And when the war broke out, he joined the 6th Cyclist Battalion of the Suffolk Regiment and went off to serve with them in Lincolnshire. Just after the first day of the Battle of the Somme, many Suffolk battalions had taken heavy casualties, including the 11th Suffolk's, the Cambridgeshire Battalion, and Frank was part of a draft that joined them as reinforcements a few weeks after their devastation at La Boisselle on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. He served with them on the Somme and then at Arras and at Ypres in 1917, and by early 1918 he was a platoon sergeant, and during the fighting in the Battle of the Lys that month, he led his platoon in action on numerous occasions. There was no second lieutenant in charge of their platoon, it was him. And by the end of that month, it was pretty clear that the fighting in Flanders was coming to an end and another stalemate was approaching. The German army had advanced some considerable distance, but British and French units had stopped them. Frank's battalion, what was left of it, was taken out of the line, and they were sent to a hutted camp like the ones that used to be where we're standing now, a little bit further back towards Popperinge. But it was still close to the front line, a lot closer than it had been earlier in the war. But it felt safe, and Frank and his mates went into the huts for a bit of rest. The posts finally caught up with them, and a tin arrived for Frank in the post that contained a birthday cake. It had been his birthday some weeks before. His last memory of this was sitting on a bed in one of these huts, opening the lid of the tin, reaching for his jackknife to chop up the cake to distribute it amongst the men that were left in his platoon, when a large caliber German shell exploded on the road outside, and a massive fragment of that shell came through the wall of the hut and hit him in the side of the face, lifting him up and throwing him against the wall of the hut. He was very badly wounded by this shell fragment. His lower jaw was just hanging by sinews, and his spine had been fractured by the impact of the shell fragment. The stretcher bearers arrived, put him on a stretcher. The bombardment was continuing outside, and he said on several occasions as they were trying to take him away to get him into the back of an ambulance, they dropped the stretcher in panic. Now, somebody with a spinal injury being dropped from waist high onto hard ground, that was pain beyond belief. They put him in the back of the ambulance. First World War ambulances did not have sprung suspension, and it drove down a cobbled road. So again, a man with that type of injury being subjected to that, it's amazing that he didn't die en route to the casualty clearing station. But Frank survived. He was lucky that eventually he ended up in a hospital where an American plastic surgeon operated on him and rebuilt his face. Many believed at the time that he would not survive. In fact, at battalion headquarters, they actually discussed the potential award of a medal to him for his bravery during the fighting of March and April of 1918, but the medical officer stood up in front of the commanding officer and said, "In my opinion, Plum will not survive, and I do not believe in posthumous awards," so nothing was ever put forward. But Frank survived. He went on to live a very long life. He was in his 90s when I knew him, and he lived those final years in peace and tranquility at Gifford House, a great place of rest for veterans like him. He was surrounded in his room by souvenirs. He'd been awarded the Silver War Badge because he was discharged eventually because of these wounds, which he proudly wore. And I'll put a picture up on the podcast website of him at Gifford House wearing his Silver War Badge. He also had his certificates for having been discharged medically unfit. That was hanging on the wall. And he had quite a few of the artefacts that the surgeon had used to rebuild his face in his drawer, which he used to get out as rather gruesome souvenirs of his wound. But these men, they were incredible. They told their tale in a modest and even-handed way. For men like Frank, who'd not really often discussed it with many people, it came flooding out the memories of that war. And he had so many tales to tell. And I was pleased to put some of those into print in my book, Great War Lives, that was published by Pen and Sword in 2010. I described him as a Great War guinea pig, and he was. He was one of those that received that early treatment with plastic surgery to rebuild their faces and thus rebuild their lives. The road continues over a crossroads. We continue to have incredible views across the Flanders landscape here around Kemmel and across towards the French border. And we get to a T-junction where we turn right, and then a track appears on the left that gradually takes us uphill and into the wooded area on the slopes of Kemmel Hill, the Kemmelberg. As we get to the top, it meets a road, and on our left is a French military cemetery. The French National Cemetery at Kemmel is in fact an ossuary, essentially a mass grave. There's over 5,200 burials here, of which the vast majority are not identified. Most of them were killed in the fighting of April 1918, and we tend to forget, really, that the French army, the poilus, served in Flanders alongside us from the very beginning. In the first Battle of Ypres in 1914, were here alongside us during the gas attack in the second battle, and fought alongside us in the Battle of Passchendaele in the opening stage of the offensive and up towards Houtels Forest in 1917. And French forces returned to stem the tide of the German advance here in the Battle of Lys of April 1918, and most of the men who are buried in this cemetery date from that period of the war. Leaving the cemetery, we take a cobbled road going steeply uphill to an opening in the woods at the very crest of Kemmel Hill, where we see a French memorial. It's very much in an Art Deco style, and I'll put some pictures of it up on the Old Frontline podcast website. This memorial was unveiled in 1932 by Marshal Pétain, who had commanded French troops at Verdun, and within a few short years would find himself involved in another war in a very different way to the Great War. It was on the slopes of the hill here that some of the crucial fighting of April 1918 took place. The Germans saw Kemmel Hill as an important objective in their advance in April 1918 because of its high dominant position. An attempt was made on the 17th of April to take it, but was repulsed. British troops then handed over to a French corps which occupied the positions from Kemmel across to Messines, but the 9th Scottish Division, which included the South African Brigade, also hung on in this area to support the French. On the 25th of April, another German attack came in which swamped the French positions, and at one stage the 12th Royal Scots found that there were Germans 2,000 yards behind their position. The whole front was confusing and was crumbling around them. An attempt was made to retake the hill, but it failed with heavy loss, and Kemmel Hill would remain in German hands until British and American troops fought in this area in the autumn of 1918. The Battle of the Lys and the fighting in this area around Kemmel and the Flanders hills that we've seen during the course of this walk are some of the lesser known battles of the First World War. Chris Baker, a former chairman of the Western Front Association, and his incredible Long Trail website that all of us will have used at some point, has written 3 great books on the Battle of the Lys. 1, a history of it, and 2, Pen and Sword Battleground Europe guidebooks, which are incredibly detailed and very useful for visiting this part of the Western Front. We'll continue now from this part of the hill up towards the very crests, near to a cafe with a tower known as the Belvedere of Kemmel. The original tower was used as an observation post by British gunner officers from the very beginning of the war, and it was said that from here the Prince of Wales and senior officers, including General Plumer, watched the very first attack in Flanders by British troops in December of 1914, when men of the 3rd Division attacked the ground near Witchart or Whitesheet. Today this is a restaurant, and the tower isn't always open. It's quite a climb to the top, but virtually climb it we will, and from the very top of this tower we'll get spectacular views across the Flanders landscape. We'll see the entire stretch of the Messines Ridge, from south of Ypres right down to Plugster and the dark mass of Plug Street Wood. Here was the static front from 1914, from the end of the First Battle of Ypres, until the explosion of those 19 mines along this front as part of the Battle of Messines in June of 1917. We can see the villages and the spires of the churches, and the woods and the lanes, and indeed the cemeteries that act as beacons on the landscape of the Great War, all places for us to walk again, another day, along the old front line. It's that part of the podcast where we look at an object connected to the Great War. And this week I've got a memorial plaque, a death plaque, a widow's penny as they're often called. And it's not really about the actual plaque itself, but it's what it's in. And I got this many years ago. I rescued it from a junk shop. I use that term quite a lot in respect of these artefacts. Obviously I purchased it from a junk shop, but it was sitting there waiting to be rescued and brought back to a place where it could be properly appreciated, at least I like to think so. And it's a wooden frame with an image of a soldier blowing a bugle. It says carved onto it, he volunteered when duty called, and set into the actual wooden frame is the memorial plaque to Robert Hodgson Galloway. Now, he was a gunner in the 90th Siege Battery Royal Garrison Artillery, and they were involved in the bombardment in the lead up to the Battle of Messines in June of 1917. He was killed possibly as part of a forward observation team going forward to spot for the guns. He died on the 5th of June 1917, aged 29. He was the son of Mr. and Mrs. James Galloway of 17 Hurst Street, Wheatley Hill, County Durham. So how this ended up in a junk shop in Greenwich, I'll never really know, but that's where I found it. And I thought for a long time that the actual frame was unique, but then a friend of mine who collected period magazines bought a whole set of Fretwork Weekly or something like that, and he said, I've got something to show you, and it was an edition from the 1920s, and it showed the fretwork template to make the frame that I've got in my hands now. So obviously this was a fretworker's hobby magazine, and almost certainly this lad's father was a fretworker, amateur fretworker, and he made this specially for his son's plaque to go on their wall at their house in County Durham. So it's been on my wall in many houses over many years, and it's looked after by me. Like I say, we never really truly own these things. We're custodians of them. But they're important tactile objects that connect us not just back to the history of the Great War, but in this case an individual who went off to fight and died in Flanders fields, very close to the area that we're walking in this week's podcast. And I'll put a photograph of the frame with the plaque inside it up on the website so you can see what it looks like. So that's it for the Old Front Line this week. I'll see you again soon. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. Do take time to subscribe via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or other podcast services. Tell us what you think using the hashtag #OldFrontline. Follow me on Twitter @Somcore, and have a look at the podcast website www.oldfrontline.co.uk. I'll see you next week on the battlefields of the Great War.